What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back with another discography ranking for you guys. Been a little bit since we've done a discography ranking, but I figured now would be a perfect time to get one out for you guys, and we are covering a big one. Basically, as the typical mold, I put up a poll for you guys to vote on in the community tab of my YouTube page, asking from you guys on what band you'd want to see me rank next. And the theme for the last poll we did was basically all about brutal, technical death metal bands. And you had choices of Cryptopsy, Decapitated, Dying Fetus, Nile, Suffocation, and the band that got the most votes is obviously the band we're talking about, and that is, of course, Suffocation. This is an interesting one to talk about because Suffocation's an interesting band for me. Like, I'm a huge fan of their 90s material. Wasn't as familiar with their more recent output until doing this discography ranking, and I will say Suffocation definitely deserves all of the accolades that they have garnered over the years, because they, along with bands like Cannibal Corpse and Broken Hope, pioneered brutal death metal. And without bands like Suffocation, you wouldn't see a lot of modern bands out there today. Plus pioneering the slam riff, the slam breakdowns that all these slam death metal guys have taken and ripped off and not done the best job with. So, slam guys, you have Suffocation to thank for all that. But with that being said, let's talk about their history. So Suffocation formed in 1988 out of Long Island, New York, but didn't have a stable lineup. They would have like a couple of members come in and out, but in 1990 they would finally get a stable lineup, and that lineup would be Frank Mullen on vocals, who is one of the best death metal vocalists in the history of the genre. I mean, pioneering gutturals, the super low stuff. For guitars, first you have Terrence Hobbs. Then you have Guy Marcheus, and then for bass we get Josh Barron, and then for drums, one of my all-time favorite death metal drummers, and drummers as a whole, Mike Smith. So this lineup would be together for about a year. They did the Reincarnation demo, and then in 1991, Guy Marcheus would leave to go join the band Pyrexia for a little while, and be used to hearing me say Pyrexia a lot in this video. But in 1991, the band would get signed to Relapse Records, and in early 1991 would release their debut EP, Human Waste. And this was the first ever release for Relapse Records, so Suffocation part of Relapse history. Now, Human Waste, this ranks as my number 7 album. Simply put, it's an EP. There's only a few tracks on here, but all these songs kick ass. It was produced by Paul Baggin, and quite a few of these songs were basically just raw versions of tracks you would hear on their debut full length coming out later in the year. But the only song that I think is exclusive to this EP is the title track, Human Waste, where everything else has been re-recorded. Infecting the Crypts, Synthetically Revived, Catatonia, though I prefer this version of Catatonia because it is so gnarly and nasty and gross. I mean, and again, this whole EP is fucking gross in its own right. Even the album cover is fucking gross. But yeah, number 7 due to being an EP, but it's their best of the two EPs, I would say, and definitely a big step forward for Suffocation. Now, I forgot to mention that while Guy Marcheus left before Human Waste was recorded, in walks Doug Cerrito into the band. And Doug Cerrito is a hell of a guitarist. He would later play for Hate Eternal on their debut album, Conquering the Throne. So, cool little thing right there. But yeah, Human Waste ranks as my number 7. Now, on the heels of Human Waste, the band would get offered a big record contract from Roadrunner Records. Oh, back when you can trust Roadrunner. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. That's another story for another time, however. So, Suffocation signs to Roadrunner Records back during the gold rush of Roadrunner back in the 80s through to the late 90s, pretty much. And Suffocation became part of Roadrunner history. They would go away from recording in New York and go down to More Sound Studios to work with one Scott Burns at the production helm. And released in October of 1991, we get their debut full-length, Effigy of the Forgotten. This is my number one album. It's all downhill from there, but stick around because there are other great albums to talk about. But yeah, Effigy of the Forgotten, still, in my opinion, the best stuff Suffocation ever did. I mean, the production, Scott Burns nailed the production on this album. It sounds well produced, but it still sounds raw and gritty. And the brutality that this album delivers is just top notch. There's a reason why this album is considered the pioneer album for brutal death metal, but not only for brutal death metal, but also it was pioneering for technical death metal, because there are some technical bits on this album, particularly in the riff writing, as well as some of the lead work. But yeah, just top to bottom, fantastic stuff. The opening track, Liege of Veracity, once again, all you Slam guys, this is where it came from. But there are other great Slam breakdowns on this album. It's just that one gets more noted because it was the opening track. But the title track, the re-recording of Infecting the Crypts, Seeds of the Suffering is fantastic. And I love how early on, like, Terrence Hobbs and Frank Mullen both admit that they were inspired by Napalm Death, and there is a little bit of that grind influence heard, not only on this album, but pretty much throughout their entire discography. But then again, if you're a brutal death metal band, you're gonna have a little bit of that grindcore influence in there. Other great tracks like Jesus Wept, Involuntary Slaughter, and also Corpse Grinder guest appears on 2 tracks on the re-recording of Mass Obliteration, but also Reincremation. And it was really cool to hear him and Frank kind of go toe-to-toe vocally on this album, which was really cool. But yeah, top to bottom, it's an awesome album. It's a classic to this day, and who knows where death metal in general would be without this album. Then again, it was already going strong with so many other albums that I could mention, but Effigy just punches you right in the penis. So yeah, my numero uno. Now, they would go on touring in support of Effigy of the Forgotten going forward. However, in 1992, Josh Barron would leave the band and would actually join Autopsy for an album. Meanwhile, stepping in on bass, we would get Chris Richards from Pyrexia. I did warn you earlier in the video, get used to hearing me say Pyrexia over and over in this video. But yeah, Chris Richards, solid bassist, great fit in the band. And in 1993, they would go back to the studio. They would actually return to New York to work with Paul Baggin for this next album, and released in 1993, on Roadrunner, we get Breeding the Spawn. Now, this is kind of a controversial album to rank because pretty much all these songs have been re-recorded on every other release since this came out, and it's because Paul Baggin didn't do the best job production-wise. It's very thin and muddy. However, I know a lot of people hate this album for that reason. I love this album for how bad the production is, because, call me nuts, but I think this production gave the album a little bit of a black metal feel because it's so lo-fi and raw. And hell, there's even moments on this album where they kind of do get a little bit black metal at times, like doing the Hypnotic Blast beat, as well as some really fast tremolo riffs. But overall, this is my number 3 album. I love this album. Despite the production issues and financial issues with Roadrunner at the time, I absolutely love this album. All these songs kick ass. Granted, you've heard them re-recorded over time with different production each time. I prefer the original versions over the re-recordings just because I like that bad production charm that this album has. But songs like Beginning of Sorrow, which is a big example of some of that black metal kind of sneaking in there a little bit with the hypnotic blasts and the tremolo riffs. But this is definitely a much more technical album compared to Effigy of the Forgotten. Like, they really got into technicality on this album. The title track is fantastic. Marital Decimation, Prelude to Repulsion, Animalistic Offerings. Just top to bottom, fantastic album, despite the production. But also one of the big things you can hear through the mud is the bass. Like, the bass work on this album is fucking top-notch. Chris Richards definitely delivered and then some on this album. But yeah, Breeding the Spawn, my number 3. So, following Breeding the Spawn, again, more tours were going on. However, I believe sometime in 1994, Mike Smith would leave the band to pursue other things for a while. And his relationship with the band has been rather tenuous. It's like, he's either in a good place with the band or he's not. And this would be the first of 2 times he would leave the band overall. But in to step in on drums for the next album is Doug Bone, and not much is known about Doug Bone other than that later on in like the last decade he was in Pyrexia for a couple of years, and other than that, not really doing a whole lot. But in 1995, they would go back to Moore Sound Studios to work with Scott Burns once again, and thank God. And released in 1995, we get Pierced from Within. This is my number 2 album. I know a lot of people put this as their number 1 Suffocation album. For me, it's a very, very close second. Like, it was back and forth between this and Effigy for me, but I just like the slightly more raw sound of Effigy compared to Pierced, but Pierced is a fucking brilliant album in its own right. I believe this is the longest studio album that Suffocation have done to date. And top to bottom, brilliant stuff. I mean, the title track, Thrones of Blood, oh my god, even the re-recording of the song Breeding the Spawn, even a re-recording of Synthetically Revived, just top to bottom, just delivers on all fronts. And of course, with Scott Burns' production on this album, just it sounds more polished, a little bit more polished compared to Effigy of the Forgotten, but it's still absolutely fantastic. Also forgot Depths of Depravity and Thrown into Enthrallment. Those songs were just mwah. I mean, this whole album is mwah, a tasty, spicy meatball of brutality. So yeah, my number 2. Now, after Breeding the Spawn, Doug Bone would leave the band, and in walks for drums a hell of a drummer, Dave Colross, who came from Malevolent Creation and would later be in Incantation, amongst many other bands over the years, but those are the 2 big ones that he'd been in apart from Suffocation. And in 1998, they would be dropped off of Roadrunner Records, and shit happens with record labels, so they went back to the studio to do their second EP, this time on a label called Vulture Records. Once again, Scott Burns producing, and released in 1998, we get their second EP, Despise the Sun. This is my number 8 overall Suffocation release. I do think it's a solid EP for what it is, but definitely the production, not the best in terms of Scott Burns' production, and this was around the time when Scott was kind of on his way out, because he was not enjoying being pigeonholed as being the death metal producer, and also getting hate from other people around the world, particularly Norway, for some reason. Oh, fuck off, Euronymous. But regardless, for an EP, this was solid. It was definitely the weaker of the 2 EPs, but I love Funeral Inception. I think that was the standout song for me of this EP, including that breakdown. One of the best Suffocation breakdowns ever, I would say, was on that track, Funeral Inception. But yeah, it's a solid EP, definitely the weakest of the 2 EPs. But regardless, yeah, and this would end up being the final release for a long time for Suffocation, as not long after Despise the Sun and doing a couple of live shows, they broke up for quite a while. However, they would reform sometime, I want to say in 2002. Yeah, in 2002 they would get back together. And with this lineup, it was basically the return to the 1990 lineup, as Josh Barron would be back on bass for a little bit, but would then be fired due to drug abuse. Guy Marcheus returns to the band, and Mike Smith returns to the band, and they would actually go back to Relapse Records and would go back to the studio sometime in 2003, early 2004, and then released in 2004, we get their comeback album, Souls to Deny. Souls to Deny, this is my number 6 album. This would also be the first of pretty much every other album since produced by Joe Sincata. And, well, Joe, on this album, didn't do the best of jobs on the production. Like, this recording is really bassy, and, like, the guitars are not quite as prominent as you would like them to be on albums. But overall, this is a pretty good album for what it is. I mean, you got some really good tracks like the title track, Surgery of Impalement, Immortally Condemned, Subconsciously Enslaved. This is solid for what it is. It's just the production, I feel, kind of killed it a little bit. And because of the situation with Josh Barron being fired due to drug abuse, that led to both Mike Smith and Terrence Hobbs having to do the bass parts for this album. However, eventually, shortly after Souls to Deny came out, that's when they picked up Derek Boyer, who came from, oh my god, so many bands. Deeds of Flesh, Disgorge, Decrepit Birth, Dying Fetus, and even played live in Vital Remains. Like, fucking phenomenal bassist. But yeah, he would come in for the tour on Souls to Deny. But yeah, Souls to Deny, my number 6 album. Not the best, but not the worst. It's solid for what it is. So like I said, Derek Boyer officially joins and would tour heavily off of Souls to Deny, and then would get back to the studio sometime in late 2005, early 2006, and then released in 2006, once again on Relapse Records, we get their self-titled album, Suffocation. This is my number 5 album. I think this should have been the next in line after Pierced from Within in terms of the full lengths, because the production definitely stepped up big time. Like, everything is much more prominent, though the bass is slightly less in the mix this time, whereas it was kind of a little bit more forward in the mix on Souls to Deny. The bass was kind of pushed down a little bit on this album to kind of give the guitars, the vocals, and the drums a little bit more room to shine in comparison to the bass. But overall, this is a great album. I definitely plan to pick this one up at some point and put it in the collection. But I mean, songs on here that just absolutely kick ass, like Abomination Reborn, Bind, Torture, Kill, Creed of the Infidel, and probably the heaviest and most brutal love song ever recorded in music history, In Trails of You. It is such a great song that even Frank Mullen sang that song for his wife at their wedding. So that's how committed to brutal death metal he is, that he would sing that song for his wife at a wedding, which is kind of funny, but also really cool. But yeah, top to bottom, this is a great album, and even the re-recording of Prelude to Repulsion is solid, even though I prefer the original, personally, but that's just me. But, yeah, I feel like this should have been the comeback album for Suffocation over Souls to Deny, because the songwriting on here was much better. Like, it's got more hooks going for it, but still retaining that brutal technical edge that Suffocation has been known for pretty much throughout their entire career. But, yeah, this is a great one. Number 5. So, more touring goes on for quite a number of years for Suffocation after this album, as they actually, I believe they did a tour with Black Dahlia Murder around this point. I could be wrong in that, or it might have just been a festival thing. But they toured pretty much for the next 3 years, but would go back to the studio in 2009, and no longer on Relapse Records, but they would be on their current label now, Nuclear Blast Records. So in 2009, they make their Nuclear Blast Records debut, and released in 2009, we get Blood Oath. Pretty much retaining the same lineup as the self-titled Frank, Terrence, Guy, Derek, and Mike. Although this would end up being the final album with Mike Smith fully on the album, and Joe Sincata once again as the producer. This album is my number 10. This is my last place one, largely due to the production. The songs aren't bad. I actually think the songs are good on this album, but the production, it's like the bass was a little more forward on Souls to Deny, not as much on the self-titled, but the bass is super forward on this album. It's like, Joe, find a happy medium when it comes to the production, because with how bassy this album is, it's just makes it kind of tough to listen to at times. But the songs are really good on this album. Songs like the title track, Pray for Forgiveness, Mental Hemorrhage, Provoking the Disturbed. There's some really good songs on this album. It's just the mix completely kills it for me, because the bass, I mean, I love bass being prominent on the albums, but not quite like this, where it just takes over everything. Like, the guitars are mushy on this album, the drums are not as prominent, the vocals are a bit buried. Yeah, it's like, Joe, find a happy medium with this stuff, honestly. But apart from that, really good songs, but the production killed it, and that's why it's my dead last Suffocation album. Now, like I said, this would end up being the final full length for Mike Smith being in the band, as, once again, kind of pointing out, relationship with the band is a little bit tenuous. It's like either he's in a good place with the guys or not so much. But in to take his place for this next album, Dave Kulross comes back, and they would get back to the studio in 2012 and then released in 2013. Once again, Joe Sincata producing, but Chris Zeus Harris, who has done work for bands like Hatebreed over the years, would come in to mix this album. And thank God, because after the mix of Blood Oath, Joe needed some help. And released in 2013, we get Pinnacle of Bedlam. This is my number 4 album. I will say this is the best album of their comeback run since Souls to Deny. This is a hell of a journey of an album. It's brutal, yet there's some great technicality on here. Now, like I said, while Blood Oath was the last full length for Mike Smith does appear on the re-recording of Beginning of Sorrow on this album. But, I mean, great tracks such as Purgatorial Punishment, Cycles of Suffering, the title track, As Grace Descends, My Demise, Rapture of Revocation. Top to bottom, this is a fantastic album, and I will say one of the best albums of 2013, I would say. Even though I wasn't ranking albums back then, if I were to rank this album amongst the pantheon of amazing releases that year, this would have made like a top 50 ranking for sure. This is some awesome stuff. And yeah, my number 4. Now, after Pinnacle of Bedlam came out, Guy Marchais would leave the band once again. As he said, he was pretty much mentally checked out by this point, and he kind of wanted to move on and do some other things. Now, over the next few years, a bunch of different guitarists would come in place of Guy up until they get their new guitarist, Charlie Irigo, who also is from Pyrexia. Once again, Pyrexia and Suffocation like to swap a lot of members, it seems. So Charlie steps in as second guitarist, and Dave Kulross would leave once again, and in walks their current drummer, Eric Moratti, on drums. And they would get back to the studio, and released in 2017, we get their last album, as of this recording, of The Dark Light. This one is my number 9 album. I think with this album, it's too polished for Suffocation. Like, Suffocation needs to be a bit raw, it needs to be a bit gritty and nasty sounding, but with a great production. Here, again, Zeus doing the mix, I think he went too far in the mix. This album sounds a little too clean for this band. And also, some of the songs kind of feel a little bit too much like sterile tech death, not as brutal. But there are some really good songs, like pretty much all of the singles from this album, like the title track, Return to the Abyss, Clarity Through Deprivation. Basically, all the tracks that were released as singles were great, but the others just kind of blend together for me personally. And yeah, the production being too clean kind of affects this album. And also, this is not... And Frank isn't even on all of the tracks on this album. Like, Kevin Moeller would step in to do vocals on a couple tracks, who also comes from Pyrexia. So yeah, this is kind of the first one without Frank. Even though Frank's pretty much on like 90% of this album, you do got another vocalist kind of giving his take here and there on this album. Because Frank, this was around the time when Frank was starting to not do live shows as much because of a full-time job he had. And that would eventually lead to him retiring from full-time touring in 2018. But hell of a farewell for Frank, because Frank, like I said in the beginning, one of the best death metal vocalists to ever exist. But it's good that he's doing well for himself right now. Now, as far as the current lineup, currently they're still on Nuclear Blast Records, and now their vocalist is Ricky Myers from Disgorge, who's actually the drummer for Disgorge, not known as a vocalist. But Ricky steps in now, and he does a great job. Like, he sounds very much like Frank to some extent. So the current lineup is himself, Terrence Hobbs, who's really like the only, quote, original member left, Charlie Arrigo, Derek Boyer, and Eric Moratti. And I know that currently they're in the studio doing work for their next album, which I assume is going to be out in 2023, probably. And I hope we get it soon, because I do hope they can return to their roots a little bit and get back to what they're known for, and that's technical brutality. Because Suffocation, like I said, without this band, who knows where death metal as a whole would be today. But anyways, that does it for my ranking of all things Suffocation. This was interesting to go through, considering, like, I was only familiar with, like, half of this discography, but then checking out the other half, and I was glad I did. So, it was a fun journey through brutal grossness, so to speak. But as far as what's on the docket for rankings coming up, I have an idea on what the remaining rankings for 2022 is going to be. So, October, sometime around the second to third week of October, I am going to be ranking Blood Red Throne. I am looking forward to doing that one because I wanted to give an underrated band a chance at getting some exposure more on this channel, and I figured Blood Red Throne would be an appropriate band to rank for October. However, on Halloween Day, which will be on a Monday this year, what better band to rank on Halloween than Typo Negative? That is going to be a difficult one to rank, because pretty much I'll say right now, all their albums are fantastic. So to rank them, it's gonna hurt a little bit, but yeah, that's going to be a lot of fun. November, we're doing Deicide, which is going to be interesting considering I've never been the biggest Deicide fan apart from 3 or 4 albums, but to go through everything, it's going to be interesting. And then for December, there is currently a poll up for it, but I'm going to close that poll because it's pretty much set in stone. December, it's going to be Black Sabbath, and that's going to be a tough one because it's 20 albums. Well, 19 Sabbath and then 1 Heaven and Hell album, but still, 20 albums. Oh dear, that might be the longest video ranking I've done. If you thought the Metallica one was long, this one will probably be double that. We'll see. But anyways, thank you guys for watching my Suffocation album ranking. Horns high, and I'll see you guys later.
I've noticed that once people hit Slayer, they're like, is there something more extreme than Slayer?
Yeah, it's the crossroad, you know. Either you're going like, okay, this is too much, or you're like, I need more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I found Cannibal Corpse on YouTube when I was 12 or 13, and heard the Hammer smash the Face bass solo.
Of course.
Of course, already then I was a bass player, but when I heard that, I was like, okay, That's what I'm gonna do. This is it. And then just spiral downwards from there.
And it just keeps growing and growing and growing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it never
Yeah.
stops. It devours you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because